Hi, everybody. My name is Maud Perrier-Camby. I'm working for the Aerospace Valley cluster. Thank you for joining us. I suggest that we wait a little bit more because not all of the participants are connected yet. So thank you for waiting. We will start in 5 minutes from now. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. We have 90 attendees registered, so that's why I like to wait a little bit more to have most of the participants before we start. But I suggest that we wait for 2 minutes more and then I'll start the presentation with my colleagues. Thank you. So thank you for waiting. I think we can start now this webinar on the emerging space nations that will be presented by PwC, the space practice. As a short introduction, I should let you know that this presentation will be shared with you, such as the studies done by PwC, Also, you can write all your questions in the chat box. We will answer at the end of the presentation. And before we start with the study, I would like to present briefly the Aerospace Valley cluster, because not all of you are members of our cluster. So as a start, I should introduce myself. So my name is Maud Perrier-Camby. I'm in charge of European projects and also the internationalization of SMEs for the space team in Aerospace Valley. So what is Aerospace Valley? Just trying to move on. Okay. So Aerospace Valley is a cluster working for 4 industrial sectors, which are aeronautics, space, drones, and embedded system. We are based in the southwest of France, in 2 regions, Nouvelle-Aquitaine and Occitanie. We are located, we have offices in several cities, which are Montpellier, Toulouse, Pau, Bordeaux, and Rochefort. The aim is to be as close to our members as possible, because as you can see here, we have more than 800 members, among them almost 600 SMEs. We are happy to have a huge network of more than 10,000 contacts, which gives us the possibility to support many SMEs and companies to set up research and development projects. So what do we do? So as I just said, we foster collaborative research and development projects. We accelerate the development and growth of our members. We try to initiate the emergence of services and innovative products. We tend to be the voice of our members at regional, national, but also at European and international scales, thanks to our collaborations. So as I said, we serve 4 markets, but all these markets are also in line with the agriculture, health, smart transportation, energy, and blue growth. So this was quickly a short introduction of Aerospace Valley. And now I will leave the floor to my colleagues in PwC. PwC is a member of the Aerospace Valley cluster, and we are very happy to have today with us Tala Ati and Alisa Frelings, which are senior associates at the space practice and who did this study on the space emerging nations under the framework of the United Nations for the 2030 agenda. But they will give you more information just now. I'm just giving you, okay, the control. And I think now you can start your presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Maud. So good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for attending this webinar and for viewing our study. So my name is Talati. I am a consultant in the PwC space sector, in the PwC space practice that is based in Paris, actually. So it's a dedicated practice that works on projects related to the space industry. So I'm here today with my colleague Alisa Freyling. She can introduce herself.
Hi.
And we'd like to present to you actually our work on a paper that we have submitted to the IAC 1 year ago. And this paper mainly looks at the emerging space nations around the world and about what their role is in supporting sustainable development and socioeconomic growth around the world. So this study, the framework of this study is the Space 2030 agenda of the UN, which we'll introduce in a minute. And yeah, I think we can start. So I'm trying to move in slides. Okay. So I'm sure we're all here aware about the main trends in the space sector and about the benefits of the space activities. However, I will just provide a brief overview in case we have people that are not from the space sector but interested in the topic, so I'll be quick on this. But as we've seen, we have witnessed many changing trends in the space sector recently. At the level of the governance, we have seen a shift from mainly governmental-led and governmental-owned projects towards more involvement from the private sector, emergence of SMEs and startups that are looking or that have actually found business opportunities in the space industry, more collaboration and partnerships between the entities rather than, of course, the more competitive way it used to be before, and even more PPPs, private and public partnerships between the public sector and the industry to benefit of the expertise of the different entities. Now, at an upstream level, we have also seen a shift in the approach to develop space technologies. So, as it used to be before, prolonged projects, a lot of investments, a lot of studying, as of course it's based on public money. Today, we have seen a move towards more agile technologies. We have seen a huge reduction in costs in terms of manufacturing and in terms of launch of space missions and space projects, the emergence of small satellites and the increased demand for constellations of satellites. And then at a downstream level, also, we have seen a shift from purely data-based provision, so the provision of raw data, imagery, or that it comes directly from the satellites towards more actionable intelligence. So demand is going from, instead of just give me these pictures, towards give me the information I can extract out of this picture. And this is also because, of course, the emergence of the big data and the availability of high computing power on the clouds and on the cloud storage. So the technology in the downstream sector has enabled the Earth observation-based market, for example, to shift also and combine with the big data analytics market. And all of these elements, of course, they have reduced the barrier of entry into the space sector and have made it more accessible. So I don't need to launch my own satellite to be considered as a space player. I can simply be working at the downstream sector, at the downstream part of the space value chain, as an entity, as a private company, or as a public entity as well. Now, on the other hand, so why this increased interest in the space industry and why the emergence of new players, the startups and SMEs? So, of course, the space sector, it provides a lot of benefits on an economic level, on a societal level, on an environmental level, and even strategic level. So, of course, we all know and we're aware that investments in space, like any other public investments and injection of money into the economy, it leads to GDP multipliers. So, a contract provided to a company by, let's say, a space agency. So it goes to a company. This company pays it to subcontractors. They pay their own employees. So we see an added value in terms of GDP and money spent, that of course leads to a higher GDP multiplier. And based on, we've done some assessments for different European space programs, and we usually find a GDP multiplier of 1.4 to 2.0. So this means for every $1 or euro spent in a space program, there is 1.4 up to $2 or euros in added value in the economy. Again, of course, it helps it helps support employment and jobs. And as we've seen also in several studies, that the employment multiplier in European space programs is about 1.2 to 2.4 as well. And it generates revenue in terms of government tax revenues, of course, because when money is given to a company, it's paying taxes when it's generating added value. So usually we see that around a bit more than 35% of that spending comes back in government tax revenue. So on another level, so these are the transactional impacts that of course are common to public spending, but the space sector also enables a lot of catalytic benefits. So based on the data and the information and the applications that are provided from the space sector, businesses have the opportunities to create their value added products. This creates benefits in the economy. Otherwise, the applications of the space-based services in themselves, they can create a lot of of benefits in the different industries, whether it's agriculture, whether it's mining, whether it's maritime. So you can improve your yields, you can be more efficient once you've when you're monitoring crops, for example. But even in terms of communications, satellite communications and GPS, they've allowed to connect distant remote areas that cannot be connected in classical ways because of topology, for example, of the area and the huge disparity, the huge spread of this population. So of course it improves the quality of life, it supports, it brings a lot of societal benefits, it helps by, for example, by supporting the monitoring of environmental or climate indices. We can improve the health of individuals because of the impacts of reduced emissions or etc. So at another level, of course, strategic benefits always remain important because when you develop your space sector, you're developing a very high technology and high innovative sector. You're stimulating your industry. You're creating STEM educated people and a very highly qualified workforce. So it gives you independent access to space. You don't need to depend on one country or the other. So of course, all of this goes into the benefits of developing a space sector. So trying to go to the next slide. Okay, now as of course we have seen that the space sector can hugely impact society and the environment and the economy. And as we know, the UN has been working for a long time, and the international community globally has been working to address global challenges at the level of climate change, disaster management, etc. It has a sustainable development framework. It has realized that actually the space sector can be an important tool in achieving sustainable development goals and socioeconomic growth, sustained socioeconomic growth. So it has formalized space as a frame. Oh, I have a mistake. I said in 2030 formalized efforts. That's a mistake. It's the Space 2030 agenda. So it formalized a framework in which space is used as a tool to achieve sustainable socioeconomic growth and to enable access to space technologies and space services to different countries, whether they're spacefaring nations or emerging nations, or even if they don't have capabilities in space. So this framework, the Space 2030 agenda, is based on 4 main pillars. Space for economy, and these pillars of course are connected to the benefits we've discussed before, so I won't elaborate much. But the first one is space for economy, so how space enables economic benefits coming from space technologies development or space services. Other is space for society, so how space can support the enhancement of the quality of life and the societal conditions. Third is space for diplomacy, and it's about how space can be a tool in further diplomatic relationships and in partnerships and in collaboration between the different countries. Last one is access to space. So how to improve the access of different countries to space technologies and to space-based services and applications. So these are the 4 main pillars of the Space 2030 agenda, over which we evaluated the role of the emerging nations. So, sorry, I'm trying to move to the next slide. Okay, so when we say emerging space nations, there is no one standardized way to rate what is an emerging space nation as opposed to an established one or one that doesn't go in either of the two. So there are different ways, there are different views, there is no one standardized way. So what we tried to do was have our own high-level approach to rate countries, whether they are emerging space nations or not. Of course, you have other levels of established nations, you have spacefaring nations, but we don't focus on that. So our aim is really to look at emerging space nations and the countries that have just recently started to adopt space, try to work on establishing a space sector, or even countries that have just recently tried to restructure their space capabilities. So not necessarily have never been involved in the space sector. It's just countries that have recently put more importance on reestablishing, restructuring via space agencies, via strategies, etc. So we looked at just to give you a high-level idea about what axes we look to rate whether a country is, to us, of course, an emerging space nation or not. So we look at space launch capacity, whether it has had it before, whether it's mature, whether it's just recently starting to develop it, of course. We look at the maturity of the space industry. Do you have a lot of space actors, a lot of space companies? Is it mature, your industry, or are you just recently developing your industry? Capacity building. So have you just recently started to put in effect policies to encourage to create an industry in the first place? Are you working on developing human capital, building capacities, etc.? Level of established governance. So is there like a clear structure to how space activities are done? Is it dispersed? Is it maybe under a ministry? So it can vary, of course, but we look at the level of maturity of the structure or of the governance. And we look at national space programs and where they are at today. Have they been cancelled? Have they been achieved? Have they been just developed? Or have they been there for a long time and they're now at a sustainable place? So based on these, of course, we evaluated different regions and to select who are the emerging space nations around the world, of course, again, according to us. Now, our approach, in order to look at the role of emerging space nations in achieving the Space 2030 agenda goals or objectives, we were on a more of a case study approach. We analyzed 4 different regions. So we looked at Latin America, we looked at Africa, we looked at Oceania, and at Southeast Asia. So these were the countries we've selected mainly. Mainly, to be honest, it was also because of the time and the size of the of the IAC report that can be delivered. But in each of these, of course, we have a regional overview, but then we have a case study. We have selected a country. So we have from Latin America, we've selected Bolivia. From Africa, we have selected Egypt. From Oceania, we've selected Australia. And from Southeast Asia, we've selected Singapore. And actually, we looked at another region, which was the Middle East, and we've selected Lebanon in that country, in that region. So actually, it's more 5. So today, we're going to present to you only 3 out of these case studies, but our approach was mainly to look at their overview. What is their space strategy? What is their space policy? What are their objectives, their drivers, their challenges, and try to rate in the end their impact along each of the 4 pillars. And of course, it's based according to different NDCs. What we rate as low, medium, or high is based on NDCs along each of these pillars. So I think now my colleague Alyssa, I will start with the first case study.
Yeah, so let's dive on in. Basically, I'm going to take you through a regional overview first and then the case study that we picked for that region. So the first one we had was Africa. And in Africa, there are actually quite a few different countries starting space activities in the region or have done so for a while. These are just a selection of, there are definitely other countries than just these ones, but these are just examples to show you. For example, Algeria's had its Algeria Space Agency since 2002. It has several satellites in orbit, including some telecom satellites, and it's partnered with China to achieve that. And it's had a national space program 2006 to 2020 strategy, so it's got some framework in place and it should be updating that for beyond 2020. In comparison, Morocco doesn't have a space agency, but it does have a remote sensing space center. And that one is the one which does whatever space activities the country will oversee. And it has a surveillance satellites which have been built in partnership with France. Egypt, which, as mentioned, we'll dive into much more detail in a minute, has a newly established Egypt Space Agency. Before then was just one of the sort of remote sensing centers. And it will be the host of the African Space Agency. And this country has launched actually quite a few satellites in partnership with other countries, so it is fairly developed in that sense. And then Nigeria and South Africa are arguably the 2 most active countries in the region. Nigeria has the National Space Research and Development Agency. It's launched several national satellites in partnership with Russia and China, and its strategy and policy is more towards trying to develop infrastructure and support human capital, whereas South Africa has a very broad and in-depth strategy which looks towards Earth observation, space engineering, space operations, and space science. And again, it has launched in partnership several satellites. So when we look at each of these regions, we're looking at what are the sort of fragilities or challenges these regions face, where space could actually play a big role. So for example, in Africa, there are several common fragilities that we can see. We're not saying every country will face every challenge, etc., but these are sort of the common ones, including economic uncertainty, whether that's high levels of poverty, or maybe some countries have a high dependency on certain commodities whose prices have crashed recently. There is a lack of infrastructure or inefficient transportation, which can pose barriers to trade. There are armed conflicts and violence, risk of terrorism, illegal activities that can be human trafficking, weapons trafficking, organized crime in general, and another one where space is very well utilized can be the high vulnerability towards extreme weather events as well. So the African Union recognized space was a socioeconomic driver, and therefore it is important to have a strategy in place. So they introduced a space policy and a space strategy. And they also have pushed towards having an African Space Agency. And as mentioned, this will be hosted in Egypt, although to date it hasn't had a huge amount of progress because there hasn't been a lot of, I'd say, agreement in what form it will really take. As mentioned, there are other countries that we just don't have time to dive into: Algeria, Ethiopia, Kenya. They all have some space activities going on in the region. So we chose to look at Egypt for our use case because it's a very interesting type of emerging nation. Obviously, it does have some history in space in terms of buying satellites from other countries, getting Russia, for example, to build and launch the satellites for them. But it goes in a fairly traditional approach, which is to have a very centralized sector where the government is the one requesting and purchasing a lot of the space assets, and indeed that it requires space assets in general. We'll see later on that not all countries are interested in owning their own space assets. It's more about just pushing forwards the industry. So historically, the main institution was the National Authority for Remote Sensing and Space Sciences, and this was really focused on promoting the use of space technology in addressing the sustainable development agenda for Egypt, and for creating partnerships with national institutions, key GIS players, and also to promote the use of high-tech capabilities for applications in remote sensing and for space science and technology. And we have just recently seen a shift forwards into being more industry friendly, shall we say, which was they've recently sort of turned NARSS into more of the Egypt Space Agency, and this has brought about more strategy and roadmaps. So they really want to now build up and develop homegrown space capabilities and try to commercialize some of their capacities. It has a broad, this new space agency has a broad range of different divisions, for example, space imaging, space design execution, systems engineering. So they're trying to have, one could say, a more traditional approach in trying to address the sector at large. They've also just agreed upon in March of this year their roadmap, and a new 10-year strategy and space program. So they have short-term, medium and long-term goals now, which was not the case before in the same way, and is looking to develop the space industry, as well as applications in space weather, EO and climate risk mitigation. And it will also be trying to launch 2 new satellites by 2023, and there's discussions to develop a constellation within the next 6 years for surveillance and monitoring the borders, for example, and mitigating climate change risk. There's been talks between Egypt and the UAE Space Agency also in doing knowledge sharing and training to have an Egyptian astronaut. So the drivers and objectives we see in Egypt is really to push towards having a more integrated space sector now, and trying to harmonize all the different actors into more of the agency downwards. And to have further support on its national security and development goals. Its Sustainable Development Strategy 2030 was very explicit in saying the space industry is very important. It's more of a necessity than would like to have industry, which is a great mindset to have. And it is with China support, it is building its first satellite assembly center in March 2021. So it's really looking to develop homegrown expertise in industry and invest quite heavily in the space sector. And this is a shift that is quite recent because Egypt has in the past been very focused on military and security, which is why often it's paying for quite large satellites, etc., for communication and surveillance. And now we're really seeing a new push towards supporting industry. And as we said before, it's hosting the African Space Agency, but right now there hasn't really been clarity in terms of what impact that will have on each of the countries' budgets, etc. So there hasn't been much progress in the last little while. So it has historically and to date been utilizing a lot of international partnerships to build up its capacities and to expand its activities. It is well positioned in the fact that it can and has joined both the Arab Space Cooperation Group and the African Space Agency. So it actually has an inroad into both groups. And it has a history of working with Japan, the US, the UAE, and ESA/the European Union. It has a strong tie with China. It has a memorandum of understanding and high investment from China. As I said, the satellite assembly, integration and testing facilities and ground station facilities are being built with support and expertise from China. And also one of the satellites that it's going to be launching is paid in part by a grant from the Chinese government. In the past, it's launched a lot of its satellites through partnership with Russia, who's like built and launched their satellites for them. And under the new Egypt Space Agency, they've signed a bilateral space cooperation protocol with CNES, the French Space Agency, for satellite development, training, and exploration of outer space. Italy is another one where they've had a long history of working together, and this year they're going to be purchasing a military radar satellite from them. So some of the challenges it still faces are historically, it's had difficulty in retention of trained engineers. Obviously, its new strategy to date is going to be trying to build up this skilled workforce and give them more opportunities to stay in the country. But obviously, it has had previously a very sort of fragmented space sector in terms of it's been scattered amongst different institutions. So now it has a fairly ambitious roadmap. It will be interesting to see how it progresses in terms of implementation. As I said, this has just been agreed in March, so we really don't know what impact it will have down the road on the industry. When we say it historically encountered several setbacks in its satellite programs, we're not trying to imply that it's going to have problems in the future. It's just that, you know, for example, Egypt Sat-1 lost communication after 3 instead of 5 years, and Egypt Sat-2 lost communication within 1 year instead of 11 years. So there has been a bit of delay in some of their national assets, shall we say. So it's just delayed what they would have liked to have achieved. And there is a lack of awareness from the public on the importance of the space sector. Now, this isn't necessarily different for Egypt versus some other countries. We have that problem even in Europe, to have the general public aware of what benefits the space sector can bring. But when you have times of economic and political uncertainty, it can be quite difficult to convey the message of why you should be wasting, and I say that in quotations, money on the space sector. So there's a sort of lack of understanding on why money should be invested. And as I mentioned, obviously the African Space Agency, we haven't seen a big boost yet in activities. And the last point we're trying to make is obviously is GDP growth is forecast to fall to 0.5% in 2020 due to the COVID-19 crisis. Now, although the country will avoid a recession. Now, we're not trying to say Egypt is going to be better or worse hit than any other country. Obviously, this is a global issue, but for each of our use cases, we did sort of look into what was forecast for them, because as an emerging sector, one which even with new space lowering costs can be quite costly, there could be impacts down the line in how much investment is made or how successful it is. So looking at impacts, obviously for access to space, Egypt owns quite a few national space infrastructure and assets, and it really wants to target this further, and it wants to target having autonomous access to space data and technology. And this is really because a driving factor for it is still military security, so it wants to keep it obviously sort of in-house as much as possible. And this is quite different to a lot of other emerging space nations that we see actually to have this focus. But to date, obviously, it's been working with a lot of international partners. We just seen they're purchasing a satellite from Italy. So currently they want to develop that further, but they're not 100% there yet. Societal wise, they have two major or main issues that can be addressed well by space. One is the sort of risk of terrorism and security, and one is the environmental challenges it faces. And this plays into the fact that it has a strong sort of military governmental focus for its sector. There is, however, little to date that has been done from an industry level in terms of, for example, addressing environmental issues. So there isn't really a history there, but we'll see maybe with its new strategy if that comes into play more. From a diplomacy perspective, it has been key to its strategy all along. So it has a lot of partnerships already in terms of developing its national infrastructure. And as I sort of hit on before, it's well located to be part of two international frameworks. So it's a very strategic location. And economically speaking, it is one of the largest economies in Africa. And it has a lot of industries based around natural resources, for example, agriculture, and these can be very well supported by the space sector. And we are expecting to see an increase in innovation and training within the country as they try to build up their homegrown capabilities. So the key points to really take away from Egypt is the fact that, you know, before it really didn't have a national strategy until this year. It had a very fragmented approach to the sector and very sort of government only. And we'll see now how much the industry will be stimulated by the new 10-year strategy. It has an opportunity to build more soft power in the regions where it is part of the two frameworks and to become a larger sort of space power for both of these. So it's a very sort of strong positioning. There has been to date not really any strategy enabling easy uptake from the industry. So there could be missed opportunities in terms of, for example, building applications for the environment. So again, we'll see how that changes with its shift in focus with having its own agency.
Sorry, that was by mistake.
No problem. I'm almost done. And there hasn't really been any engagement with between the space sector and the other industries which could really benefit from utilizing space. And this is a common problem we see, especially in emerging space countries, where an industry such as agriculture really doesn't know what benefits space can bring to it and what space-based solutions they should be using. So there's really not been any sort of engagement there. So that's an area where they could improve in the future. And of course, as I sort of keep mentioning, they have had a very sort of security military focus in the past, and so now there are a lot more opportunities perhaps for the industry moving forwards to really get involved in the space sector, but right now we haven't seen any impacts because it's a very new thing for them. And there are, so for example, there are no space specific support systems for SMEs right now, so we'll see where that goes. And now I will hand over to you.
Thanks. All right, so the next region to look into will be Oceania with a focus on Australia. I think that would be quite interesting because it varies quite a lot from how we go from Africa and Egypt toward the approach used in Oceania and Australia. So just to provide a global overview about this region, so of course it's made of several islands, and they have a very big diversity when it comes to the level of infrastructure developed and the demographical characteristics among these different islands, because of course we have the larger islands and then the smaller ones that have smaller capacities, let's say, in order to develop their infrastructure on a larger scale. And therefore we have the two largest economies in the region come from Australia and New Zealand that have quite global economies, as opposed to the rest of the other islands such as Polynesia and Micronesia and the others. So generally speaking, these regions, as they are islands, they face a lot of common challenges, which come mostly from the impacts of climate change and natural disasters. For example, a lot of hurricanes, floods, a lot of fires, as you've heard of the recent Australian fires that lasted for a long time. They had a devastating impact on Australia. On another level, of course, also in terms of maritime awareness, they all have different similar needs regarding developing their situational awareness, to look at illegal fishery, look at human trafficking, illegal smuggling through the seas. So they have quite similar needs and let's say fragilities or problems, at least, that can all be addressed with the space sector. However, of course, they don't all have the same capacity in developing a space sector. So we know that New Zealand and Australia, they are more economically viable to develop space activities and the space sector, as opposed to the rest of the islands. And therefore, even so, this gives them a great opportunity, because a space sector developed in these two countries can really bring a lot of benefits to the other islands that do not have the same level of infrastructural maturity or development. So in terms of space activities, we have, as we said, the two main. There are Australia and New Zealand is this region. So New Zealand is a fairly recent country in terms of space activity. Its engagement in space is fairly recent. It developed its agency in 2016, and it's more on the level of a new space approach. So it's focused on fostering the industry, on developing the industry, encouraging it, and the private sector. And it has actually, which is quite unique for an emerging space nation, relatively quite unique for an emerging space nation, worked on the development of launch capacity. So we have Rocket Lab. It's one of the companies that have actually managed to develop a micro launcher. And it actually, in New Zealand, we have the first in the world private launch facility. So we know that this approach it has to foster the industry, it actually has paid off with the Rocket Lab example. Now, Australia is a little bit more different, because Australia has been engaged in the space sector for a while, since the 80s and the 90s. It had an Australian office to deal with the space sector. However, it has recently, just in 2018, established a space agency, the Australian Space Agency, which was mainly streamlining all of its objectives and all of its efforts, as opposed to how it was before. And it has launched a very structured or a very clear roadmap in terms of what it would like to achieve on the following years, and that was through its civil space strategy 2019 to 2028. So I will go start on the use case of Australia. Okay, so basically Australia's space strategy is fixated among 4 different pillars or objectives. One is to open up to the international space economy and the international space sector. It wants to provide its own industry the chance to compete in global industry. So it's sort of opening the door for the competitiveness of its market to collaborations on an international level. On another level, it's working on developing its own national capacities. So as it's fairly recent and let's say re-establishing its efforts, it needs to develop its national capacities, national technologies in any key strategic areas that it has, which we'll go into in a minute. And it wants to promote a safe, regularized environment for its industry. To say it aims to provide a regulatory framework for its industry, and wants to promote the industry itself and the private sector to be more involved in space activity. So its entire strategy is based on I am going to try to create a favorable environment for my private sector, and of course I want the private sector to take the lead in investing and in developing the space industry, the space capacities, and the space sector. So responsible, as we've mentioned, it wants to ensure national safety and security as it moves towards the development of the space sector. And inspire is the last pillar, which is basically to develop the workforce it needs in order to sustain its objectives and its goals. So to ensure that it's providing the right training, investing in the human capital and the workforce, and encourage the different entities to collaborate together, whether it's from the public sector, the industry, the startups, the SMEs, the private sector. So it wants to create a favorable ecosystem based on collaboration, based on initiative from the industry in order to develop its space sector. So Australia generally is targeted aims to go towards supporting its economy on a broader level, creating job opportunities, and the space sector here, it's one tool to support it in achieving its objectives. Now, in terms of what are its objectives, as we can see, Australia has, so I think we can see different types of trends in the emerging space nations regarding what sort of objectives or key areas they want to address. And I think the main difference comes from whether it's a developed country or a developing country that's developing space activities. And with Australia here, we see that it has diversified its key priority areas. So as opposed to what we normally see in emerging space countries that focus on one domain, maybe space applications, Australia is really working on developing its capacities on both the upstream and the downstream, but in the terms of supporting development of robotics and automation technologies, supporting Earth observation activities, and even different programs like situational awareness, monitoring debris. And so it has targeted the different, let's say, domains of space, of the space sector. And actually quite interesting is it also targets to pursue space exploration activities. It's trying to encourage its industry to pursue space resource utilization types of activities, to develop its technology on the first level, not to launch its own missions, but rather develop the technologies, the key assets that are required by benefiting of its already existing and strong industries. For example, it has a strong mining industry. It's aiming to engage this industry in space exploration to see the synergies between its strong industries and how they can support its space exploration objectives. and also by locating, by choosing key areas for its own economic growth, so where it has opportunities. So it's the two things. First, where am I strong? Where can my industry engage in the space sector because it has the capacities? Other level is, okay, what will bring me more benefits? Where do I have best opportunities to invest? So that has sort of been the overall approach of Australia. As we've said, it's diversified itself in terms of the key areas it wants to pursue. And what's important to note is that the space agency in itself, it wants to be a partner of the industry. So it's not just, okay, I want to promote my industry, go and do whatever you can. No, it's actually trying to create this ecosystem that will encourage the industry. It has, for example, launched an infrastructure fund where it's investing money in different projects along the 7 priority areas that it has. So it's actually also investing in promoting the industry and developing the infrastructure it needs for these priority areas. So it's not just let the industry go and do it itself. So I think this provides a very interesting opportunity for startups, SMEs, and industries to be stimulated in Australia. On another level, so of course, Australia, in its core, the core of its strategy is based also on developing partnerships. It has signed a lot of MOUs with different countries like the Canadian Space Agency, the UK Space Agency, UAE Space Agency, and with CNES in France. So mainly these MOUs are based on collaboration to help each other in key domains for each other, whether it's at the level of the industry, but also very importantly at the level of research, R&D, and university research. So it's trying to promote these partnerships in order to support each other. And one very interesting partnership it has is with the USA. It wants to partner on the Artemis project, which is basically to launch missions to the moon. As we said, it's working on space, on encouraging its industry to participate in space exploration. Its partnership with the US, it has yet to define where it's going to participate or contribute, but it has set an objective to be a partner in the moon and upcoming Mars missions. Now, of course, Australia as an emerging space nation already also faces a lot of difficulties, which is, I want to boost my industry, but okay, I need to be able to engage this industry to find its interests, let it see what are the business opportunities that are present there, because there are many. And it's an issue of being able to share the awareness with the industry and the public, as Alyssa mentioned before, because this is always an issue, and especially in emerging space nations. So to engage the public and share awareness regarding the importance of the space sector and why the industry should invest in the space sector. It also needs to be able to continue developing its workforce and its competence, because as it aims to compete in the global and international markets, it needs to be able to retain the capacities it develops and the technology it develops. Of course, there is a recent, so just to say, the study was done a year ago. We tried to update, of course, according like just recently, but there might be some elements missing. However, of course, we have looked at the issue of the COVID virus, and which was a global challenge, and it actually has led for Australia to go through a recession. And we don't know how yet, but we expect that this might also impact the space sector. Again, not saying that only this emerging space nations space sectors will be impacted, but as it's let's say, we don't know how resilient the space sector is yet, it might maybe discourage investment in the space sector. So at the level of the impact, I'll try to be quick because we don't have a lot more time. So as we said, Australia has a lot of, Australia and the Oceania region has a lot of fragilities to deal with on a social level, whether it's from disaster support, disaster relief, and monitoring, supporting monitoring environmental indices to be able to better forecast any crisis that will come along. So this would have, the space sector could have a huge impact in supporting disaster relief or even mitigation and building resilience there. And we believe, of course, this will not only benefit Australia, but also the rest of the Oceania islands. At the level of diplomacy, of course, it's already really highlighted partnerships. It's actually created an investment plan that will prioritize projects that include or promote collaboration and partnerships. At the economic level, Again, there are a lot of industries in Australia and the neighboring countries that would largely benefit of space sectors such as forestry, mining, oil and gas, because that's a big industry there, manufacturing. So all of these are industries that can really benefit from the space sector. In terms of access to space, let's say it doesn't have its launch capacities yet, even though it's working on that. It really does have access to satellite-based information and products. So main takeaway from there is that Australia really has the ability to be a provider for space solutions in the region, to cooperate perhaps with New Zealand to avoid replication in some niches, because these are the two most important space activities in the region. And yeah, so this is mainly Australia. I will move to.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute.
Yeah, sorry.
So let me jump in because I know we're running out of time and people will want lunch, etc. So we won't keep you. But the last region that we're looking at is Southeast Asia, or the sort of association of Southeast Asian nations, basically. So that's how we grouped this one together. So what we've seen in our other examples is Egypt is very much a sort of, okay, we still care strongly about military and security, even if we're expanding, so government's heavily involved. Australia, where it's like government is trying to lay a strong foundation, but really wants the industry to push forwards. Now, we're going to dive into an example where there's not a lot of governmental support, and it's sort of organically grown from the industry. So to just dive in at a regional level, there are some space activities in this region, but there's quite a disparity between countries that have some of these capabilities and countries that don't, especially those who lack any high-tech industry in general. Vietnam has its National Space Center, and it wants to have its own satellite by 2022, for example. Malaysia has just established its agency by streamlining a couple of its previous agencies into one umbrella one, and it wants to look to having more capabilities, but right now it doesn't have any sort of high-tech industry. Indonesia, for example, has actually a national space law, which is quite unusual for an emerging space nation to have one set up so soon, and it wants to achieve self-sufficiency and competitiveness, but its capabilities are going to take quite a while to evolve, shall we say, and Singapore we'll dive into in a minute. So the aim and purpose of the association is to really foster economic growth, social progress, promote regional peace and stability, promote active collaboration, and really sort of collaborate, especially within agriculture and industries and trade in general. So we can really see how space could be a very useful tool for their goals. And there are challenges similar to what we've seen before, maybe in Oceania. There's for sustainable development and growth, there's a fairly complex geopolitical scenario between some countries in terms of overlapping claims to territories, and there's a wide range of different GDP per capita, which is what I sort of touched on before. And there's also impacts from wider trade challenges, especially with China's economic slowdown and the sort of tariff war between China and the US, and these have had impacts on the region. So Singapore is our use case, and compared to the other two, they haven't got any sort of official space agency. What they have is, under the development board, an office for space technology and industry, and this is trying to sort of push for research capabilities and support a growing satellite industry in Singapore. They're really focused on small satellites. They have provided some thematic grant calls, and they had the Satellite Industry Development Fund with a budget of $90 million, but that was 2013 to 2018. I have not seen any proof that they have set up another fund after that period of time. From an academic perspective, some of their universities have launched satellites, especially from technology sort of missions. For example, the Nanyang Technology University collaborated with an institute in Japan. It's launched 9 satellites to date for tests and other purposes. And because there is a lack of governmental oversight, one of the principal actors is actually a non-government, non-profit trade association, the SSTL, and it really provides, it acts as the administrator for Singapore's use of the Japanese experiment module on the ISS, and it provides quite a few different services to the industry, such as business consultancy, introduces challenges for companies to participate in. It's got one ongoing right now with the World Bank for looking at humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And it has an accelerator for startups from pre-seed up to Series B, and it has a specific accelerator, which is Project Cyclotron, and that's aimed really at like high-risk early hardware startups, which are developing what they call deep tech. They also have the SGI Innovate, which is not space focused specifically, but it brings sort of corporate backing and investment capital together for any sort of innovative type of business. And there is the Incubator Astropreneurs Hub, or Astro Hub, which sort of provides training and experimental kits to SMEs. So some of its drivers and objectives, obviously it doesn't have a clear roadmap or strategy in place from the government's perspective, but a lot of the primary focus is on resource management and increasing skills and innovation. Really a lot of focus is on the small sat industry. SSTL is sort of aiming to try and make Singapore a regional space hub of, to help the other countries as well. And is trying to have educational and outreach programs for STEM careers and for business-focused initiatives. One of the differentiators, as I sort of touched on, is its emerging space sector has sort of come from startups. It's a very business-friendly country. Has been very appealing for startups, and it's gone from being very sort of research-based to, in a few years, having over 30 private companies in this space, which is quite a lot for private space companies. And it's because it's a business-friendly environment, it has economic stability, it's a financial hub that attracts private investors, and it already has a strong electronics manufacturing industry. So there's a lot of opportunities to sort of collaborate with that industry for small satellite components. And it's also a strategic location for entering the Asian market. It doesn't have a lot of key partnerships, especially because there is no drive from the government in forming them. I touched upon its relationship with Japan. Academically, there's a lot of collaboration, and of course they can access the module on the ISS. Other than that, there is an MOU with the Space and Aeronautics Association of Indonesia, and just recently they've launched a partnership for the Future Initiative with the UK, where they're already collaborating in quantum technologies. So for challenges, obviously, because it doesn't have an agency or any roadmap from the government, there's a lack of a cohesive message coming through, and a lack of support for developing the sector and for developing collaboration. There's not a lot of funding as well. There's like not many specific grants, for example. And the fractional nature of the space sector means that you do risk losing some momentum in developing it further if there's no focused support or drive from the government. As before we have mentioned, for the other two countries, the Ministry of Trade and Industry downgraded the 2020 GDP growth for Singapore to -7% to -4%. So it has been hit quite hard, but we don't know how much that will affect its new space sector. In terms of access to space, it has very limited national infrastructure. It's been very research driven to date. Small satellites, of course, is key for it, but this is mainly through academic institutions. So it's having a slow growing ability for nationally built infrastructure, but there's not a lot of historical expertise yet in the industry, even though it has strong IT and manufacturing capabilities. It faces societal challenges such as climate change, environmental change, and the need for maritime situational awareness. And because there's little coordination at governmental level, there hasn't been many activities in tackling these to date. In terms of diplomacy, again, it has a lot of opportunity because by building its space sector, it can collaborate and have closer connection with the other Asian space powers such as Japan, China, India, or South Korea, but who are all trying to play a much bigger role in the region for space. But right now, there is no cohesive partnership program set in place, even though for international companies, Singapore has been quite appealing to set up base in. And from an economic perspective, as I've said before, electronics and manufacturing is very strong already, so there's a historical precedence there. And the country also sits on the crossroads between sort of three substantial economic regions of opportunity, which is China, India, and then, as I said, the association of Southeast Asian nations. So the key points to make here is, of course, to have a better drive from the government because it may miss opportunities otherwise. The industry is also saying it needs better financial support, better networks amongst institutions and industry, and more help in building those partnerships that it needs on an international level. And there are opportunities for collaboration by the fact that it has high-tech industry already in place, and that is why it's been so attractive for a lot of startups. And it does have a lot of support for SMEs as well in terms of accelerators and in terms of private investment, etc. So just to finish up, we did, as Tyler mentioned right at the start, we did look at other regions as well. We did look at other use cases. We did dive into other countries within each region, but of course you're limited to what you can expand upon. So our key takeaways and knowledge comes from a much broader picture than even we've presented here today. But what we really saw was some common challenges for emerging space nations throughout, and those were really the need or the lack of national strategy and a long-term roadmap, the need for awareness and outreach, the need for capacity building, and building a link between the government and the industry. So in order to have a welcoming environment for building a space sector, it really needs a long-term roadmap for space activities from a governmental perspective, and also in order to have activities in place long enough that the industry can really start to capitalize on these activities and these benefits. And there is a need for the national strategy because in order to have sustainable activities and capacities, really need to lay out the groundwork of how that will happen and what sort of framework they're functioning under, also to retain your workforce expertise and to find out which assets you already have in existence and to really leverage off those. There's also the need to really sort of address industrial sectors that can benefit greatly from space activities, and many of these countries have clear socio-economic development policies that they're trying to achieve, and space is a great tool in which to achieve it. So there really needs to be more integration from the economy and the sector in order to achieve these goals. We've seen today there are some emerging nations that are more driven by the government, some more by the private industry, but it's honestly vital that both of these play a role in the space sector. The government needs to provide financial and networking opportunities and ensuring correct legislative frameworks, and the industry really needs to embrace and uptake new technology in order to drive the sector forwards. There is a lot of opportunity in international frameworks from the perspective of having more established nations supporting the emerging nations, but also for emerging nations to offer some niche areas of expertise that they can offer to these established actors. And in terms of regional support as well, as we've seen, for example, in Oceania, you've got some countries that can and have been developing their space capabilities, but these can really be used to address challenges for the region overall. So there's a lot of reach there for support. And finally, it is very important for there to be awareness raising and outreach, both to industry and to the broader public. It's difficult, and we've seen it in even more established actors. It's difficult to explain to the public the benefits the space sector can bring, and the importance of investing in a national sector. And it's important to sort of portray that to the general public so they understand where their money is going and what benefits they're receiving. But it's also important to let the industries know, and we named a lot of these: mining, oil and gas, agriculture, etc. Like these industries also will be missing out on benefits if they don't understand how they can utilize space-based solutions. So these were the key points that we found. I don't know if you guys have any questions. If not, thank you a lot for listening and coming today.
Thank you, Alisa. Thank you, Tala. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation, and especially to dive into, as you said, into the 3 countries we've decided to focus on together. Sorry, I think we are too many to playing with the mic. Just would like to go back to this map you've done.
Mm-hmm.
Because there were 2 questions. The first one was somebody wrote that he was quite surprised to see Brazil as a space emerging nation. They would like to specify that it was for space nations, of course. But would you like maybe Alisa or Tala specify a little bit why Brazil? We've decided not to focus on South America because, of course, it's another region and there's a lot to say, and we don't have much time today. But we're thinking that why not organize a similar webinar on this South America region? So maybe. But if you want to give some insights already today.
Yeah, for sure. So about Brazil, again, as I said, there are different ways to standardize and describe or rate these countries. And the reason we put Brazil in this group is not because it has never done any activity in the space sector. On the contrary, Brazil has a long history of participation in the space sector. It just comes out of its reignition of the space sector. So as we said, we looked at 2 things: whether it's the first time an entity is developing in space, or whether it has recently decided to reignite its space sector, put more efforts on it, continue with a more sustainable approach towards it. So this is really where it comes from. Not at all that it never had. Sorry.
Yeah, and just to jump in, it's also because, as Tala said, it has a long history of different activities, but they come in a lot of stops and starts. So it's very difficult to see like a long-term cohesive space sector existing in Brazil. It has a lot of capabilities, but it doesn't always utilize them for various political, economic, otherwise reasons. But recently we've seen Brazil really trying to sort of streamline and kickstart, shall we say, the industry again, and this is why we perceive it as a bit more of an emerging nation right now rather than established, because it hasn't been doing much in preceding years to a certain degree.
And this actually is the case for many countries. So it got really tricky sometimes to define where's the line where we say, yes, this is an emerging space nation or not. And that's why we did just our axes, some ratings, and final rating. So it's very high level, again, our classification.
Thank you very much. And there is also quite similar question regarding Europe. So I'm just gonna read the question. Beyond these regions and looking to Europe, which nations would be considered to be space emerging ones? So we can see here in the map that we have some countries in Europe that has to be considered as emerging countries. We'll not have time to focus on each country, but maybe you want to share the general ideas of which are these countries in Europe?
Yes, again, so we didn't do a deep analysis on Europe because many of the countries through ESA or have already established, they're already established in the space sector, whether or not they have very strong capabilities. But I think if I may put just one high-level trend we noticed, it's that Eastern Europe is recently really trying to be more engaged in the space sector. So it's mostly such countries that we've rated as emerging space nations. So it's mainly from Eastern Europe.
I think you see a lot of boost in manufacturing, especially trying to appeal to have some of the bigger European businesses maybe set up in their countries too. Yeah. And obviously there's a difference between some countries paying just a little bit into ESA, so they're very tangentially involved in the space sector, in those ones that they have to be as a member of ESA. But looking broader, obviously some such as France or Germany have a very clear established sector even outside of ESA, whereas some really don't do any activities. So it's a very nuanced situation in Europe.
And in many of these countries we've mentioned that are as emerging space nations or ranked here, there are even ones that are trying to, let's say, formalize new space strategies or agencies, so to re-establish the structure as well.
And there is one more question. Well, it's related to this one. In Europe, what are the main challenges that these emerging nations face due to the fact that there is a quite high competition in Europe with the use of space data, and specifically what is the case of Portugal? I don't know if you have everything to answer that question now, or if maybe it's written in the study you've done, or if you can give some inputs now. I don't know.
So we did not do an analysis over the European region yet, but I don't know, Alyssa, if you want to.
I mean, in the case of Portugal, we really didn't deep dive much into that. They're right in stating that there's going to be high competition in Europe. There's also a very big challenge in the fact that as an emerging nation, you've got some very big hitters, shall we say, in the region, who will also be very strong in terms of winning the contracts from the European Commission as well. There is a lot of support system in place, though. ESABIC, there's a lot of the business incubators in many European countries that are helping the sort of startups, for example. So there is a sort of good system in place for SMEs, including in countries I think you wouldn't necessarily assume have a lot of space activities going on. So it depends also on how much the country wants to stand alone as a space actor, as in like, we want to establish a space agency, we want to do more activities, versus trying to just have more budget and integration into ESA. I mean, the UK, I know it's a touchy country considering the political scenario, but even before Brexit, shall we say, it's not exactly an emerging space nation, but it does have a lot of similarities compared to Australia, for example, where it's taken a very new space approach. It was one of the first countries where really the government is trying to build a framework and build some support and funding, and they've got the satellite catapult and they've got venture capital that is space specific, but what they really are trying to do is push the industry forwards into having more of a say, and so we see that in Australia as well. So I think a lot of the sort of emerging nations, perhaps in Europe, would maybe think more on that sort of line where the government sort of gives a foundation, and what they're really trying to do is stimulate more of an industry, and maybe some countries where manufacturing can be done more cheaply than others, they can have more of a draw for some of these companies to set up in.
Thank you very much. At the moment, there's no more questions. So I suggest that we can conclude here for today. But as we said before, the presentation will be shared, and you also have access to the study, where you will find all the other case study, which were Lebanon, Bolivia, and I probably forget some. Sorry, but for sure, we remain at your. You will receive the presentation, and you will have access to the to this video in YouTube, in the channel of Aerospace Valley. And if you wish, you have our contacts. So if you want to know more, if you want to have more contacts, feel free to send us emails. Thank you, Alisa. Thank you, Tala, very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
And hopefully we can dive into more countries sooner or later. Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.